Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video by a guy named John Bevere, I think I'm saying that right, in which he attempts to answer the question, how reliable is the Bible? Personally, I would say it depends on what you're looking to get out of it. Are you looking to learn about ancient Hebrew culture? Then it can be very reliable. Are you looking to learn about history? Then sometimes it's reliable, but sometimes it's not. Are its supernatural claims reliable? I would argue no. Let's take a look.
People spend more time on social media today than they do in the scriptures. People spend more time reading blogs than they do in the scripture.
Sure, that's probably true for most people. But you say that as though this were a new phenomenon. It may not have been social media and blogs when I was a kid, but there were certainly plenty of sermons preached bemoaning the activities that people were engaged in that were not spending time in the scriptures. When I was a kid, it was that newfangled Nintendo 64 contraption that captured the hearts of children and teenagers everywhere. But sermons along these lines were actually partially responsible for my fall into atheism, as the guilt for not having spent as much time as I should reading the Bible led me to try and read the Bible all the way through when I felt my faith slipping, and ultimately, it's what I found in the Bible that killed my faith. So, from that perspective, I would agree Christians should spend more time getting to know what is actually in the book that they revere.
So can we talk about the scripture for a few minutes?
That's what I'm here for.
66 books of the Bible, written over a 1,500-year time span. Do you understand how long 1,500 years is?
It's a long-ass time as far as we humans are concerned.
If I go back 1,500 years from right now, we're at 515 AD. There hasn't even been a British Empire yet.
Yeah, long time from the human perspective, long enough for cultures to shift, which is something we can actually see in the Bible. In the earlier books, multiple wives are the norm. The more recent books speak out against marriage in general, but when it is allowed, we see that the practice of polygamy, while still not explicitly condemned, is at least frowned upon. Elders, overseers, and deacons are not allowed to have more than one wife, but it doesn't say anything about people who don't seek to hold those positions in the church, though Paul does speak of wives using the singular pronoun, implying that one is preferable to many. In addition to polygamy, you can read through as the Hebrews transition from worshipping Yahweh or El as one god of many to the monotheism of modern Judaism. And there's more than that, but that's not the focus of this video.
66 books are written by over 40 writers from 3 different continents in 3 different languages.
Yeah, that sounds impressive, but considering Israel exists pretty much where 3 different continents meet, that becomes much less impressive. And the 40 writers thing is likely a pretty low estimate. Usually the lists with 40 authors start with Moses having written the first 5 books, which we know were written by multiple authors, which had varying and sometimes contradictory versions of the stories. And really, if God had such an important message for humanity, why would he take so long to pass it down to us? Why would he not just give it all in one go? And since it took so long, how do we know that it's actually finished? Sure, the book of Revelation has that verse about not adding or taking away from the words of this book of prophecy, but that is pretty clearly meant to apply only to the book of Revelation. I know it's at the end of our modern canonized compiled Bibles, but those verses were written before several other books of the Bible were written, which means if they applied to the Bible as a whole, then there are about 7 books in the Bible that don't belong there. So maybe the Muslims are right and the Quran is the continuation of God's message to us. Or maybe the Mormons are right and the Book of Mormon is really the continuation of the message. Point is, it would be more impressive if it were just one book written by one person, and that person were actually God rather than a human being.
And you put all these guys' books together over 1,500 years. Now, many of them lived in different generations and don't know what the other guy wrote.
Living in different generations does not mean that you don't know what was written in previous generations. Case in point, both you and I have easy access to all the writings of the Bible, and commentaries often written by people of previous generations. In fact, I have 2 volumes of the Anchor Bible series, Volume 1, which covers the entire book of Genesis, and Volume 27a, which covers Mark chapters 8 through 16. They are a part of the same series, and yet they were published 45 years apart. Volume 1 was in 1964, and Volume 27a in 2009. The commentaries have different authors. E.A. Spicer, author of the commentary on Genesis, died 28 years before Joel Marcus even began working on the commentary for Mark. Joel Marcus was in a later generation than E.A. Spicer, and yet he was perfectly aware of what Spicer wrote. I am in a later generation than Joel Marcus, and I have both of their books sitting right in front of me as I speak. Sure, some of the biblical text was written in ignorance about the contents of other books of the Bible. That's actually some of how we know there were multiple authors for the Pentateuch. Some of the conflicting details seem blissfully unaware of their contradictions mere verses away, kinda like they were written without awareness of each other and then compiled by a later editor who was not concerned with inerrancy or being entirely free of contradiction. In fact, from what I've learned about rabbinical tradition from reading Karen Armstrong's biography of the Bible, the editors who compiled the Torah would likely not have worried about contradictions, as their main point with the text was to find fresh ways of interpreting it to find new meanings. A text for them was considered dead once they were no longer able to find these new meanings. The Torah was supposed to be alive, so was always subject to reinterpretation.
You put them all together and you get a perfectly harmonized book?
Perfectly harmonized is a really weird way to describe a book with so many inconsistencies. How did Saul die? How did Judas die? What were Jesus' last words? Did Jesus carry his own cross, or did he have help? Do children suffer for their parents' iniquity, or is the wickedness of the wicked only upon himself, not passing on to the son? And I could go on.
Do you know what that's like? That's like looking at 40 different writers over the last 1,500 years and saying, write a chapter of a novel, putting the whole thing together after 1,500 years and having it make any sense?
Oh, is that why a plain reading of the Bible doesn't make any sense, thereby requiring teams of scholars to figure out correct interpretations and translations and everything? Seems to me that if it actually made sense, these jobs would be superfluous. Now, maybe an argument could be made that the scholars would be needed to figure out the deeper meanings of the texts, but the apologists in particular would be completely out of a job. If it were actually a cohesive narrative, you wouldn't have need for apologetics at all, much less the several competing types of apologetics, each arguing for completely different and mutually exclusive interpretations of this book that is supposed to make perfect sense.
And the last book of the Old Testament is written 400 years before Jesus is even born.
Interestingly, this is where the scholarship divides between evangelical Christians and the rest of the scholars. The general consensus, when not actively looking for reasons to assign older dates to the books, has the Book of Daniel being typically thought to have finished around 100 to 200 BCE, with some of the Wisdom of Solomon being written up to and including the time of Christ. So, no, not 400 years before Jesus. The 400 years before Jesus comes from the timeline found exclusively on evangelical sites that are trying to claim that the Proverbs were actually written by King Solomon and that the Book of Daniel was actually written as prophecy before the events that it describes. But these are theologically motivated conclusions, not the scholarly consensus.
You got these 39 books written by all these different authors for over 1,100 years, many of them living in different generations, not knowing what the other guy wrote.
Are you actually trying to say that they lived in different locations, not generations? Because the whole living in different generations thing is still bothering me. It would be easier to not know what the other guy wrote if they lived at the same time, but in different places. Then they could be writing simultaneously, each oblivious to the other one's writings. But as soon as you put a temporal gap there, that provides the time for the writings of the earlier one to be published and disseminated to a point where the later author would have access to them. Being in a different generation makes this easier, not harder.
And you know what these guys did? They made predictions about the Messiah.
Sure they did. Was there anything specific?
Things like he'd ride in Jerusalem on a donkey.
I mean, donkeys were not exactly an uncommon mode of transport. Hell, I have a friend who owns a donkey and regularly goes for donkey rides, and we don't live in the ancient Middle East. She has some of the weirdest stories about her donkey adventures. This would be like someone in the Old West saying that a guy will ride into town on a horse one day. It is entirely mundane.
He'd be betrayed by a friend. He'd be born in Bethlehem. He'd be called out of Egypt. He would be sold for 30 pieces of silver. He'd be crucified.
I'm not going to go into every one of those, but a lot of them are not actually describing what he's saying they are. Even the ones that do seem to fit, they are so vague as to be meaningless. Hell, read the story in Zechariah 11 sometime and tell me if that seems like a Jesus prophecy to you. Literally the only thing it has in common with the story of Jesus is that there were 30 pieces of silver involved at one point. The one that says he would be crucified? That one doesn't actually mention crucifixion. It does say he was pierced, which is then immediately followed up by saying he was crushed, which very much goes against John's description of the crucifixion in which he explicitly states that not one of his bones would be broken. A piercing followed by a crushing doesn't sound like a crucifixion to me. I mean, an argument could certainly be made, but it's not conclusive by any stretch of the imagination. And then when you read the rest of the context, it is clearly not about Jesus. It talks about him as someone who spent his life being despised and rejected. This does not go well with the story of Jesus being such a popular preacher that thousands of people would turn up to hear him speak. Not to mention the bit at the end about seeing his offspring and prolonging his days. I didn't think most churches believed that Jesus had kids. And typically, these two are presented as though they are the best ones.
And they made over 300 predictions!
300? Wow, that's a lot. Let's take a look at some of these, shall we? Okay, I found a list of 351 Old Testament prophecies that were supposedly fulfilled by Jesus. These must be great. Okay, number 1, Genesis 3:15, seed of a woman, virgin birth. Okay, that's the verse where God is cursing the serpent and the woman, basically saying that humans won't like snakes and snakes will bite people. And that somehow says that Jesus would be born of a virgin? You know, because offspring. Even if I grant that the serpent is supposed to be the character of Satan, this verse doesn't say anything about a virgin birth. Okay, next up is Genesis 5:24. The bodily ascension to heaven is illustrated. Okay, Genesis 5:24 says, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And that's it. It doesn't make any more sense in context. This isn't a prophecy, even if I grant that as being a bodily ascension rather than just flowery language stating that Enoch died. It doesn't even pretend to be prophetic. It's in the middle of a genealogy. Doesn't say anything about how God took Enoch as he would later take the Messiah. Just, God took Enoch. That's it. Okay, the Genesis ones are coming up a little weak. Let's skip ahead a bit. 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 12. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. Okay, here we go. Now we're getting somewhere. Still a bit vague, but at least I could see that being applied to Jesus. Except when you read it in context, it's talking about David's son Solomon, who is credited with having built the temple. This is literally God begging David to build him a proper house instead of making him sleep in the tent, talking about how he's tolerated it this long without complaining, but it's time for a proper house, and promising that David's dynasty will last forever if they do build him a house. And then, one of King Solomon's major accomplishments that he is most well known for was the building of the temple for the Ark of the Covenant, literally God's house. So we'll put this one in the maybe pile. It's a bit too ambiguous for my liking, but so far it's the best that I've seen on the list of over 300. Okay, one more. This time let's go to Joshua, the book that made me an atheist. Joshua chapter 5 verses 14 and 15. It's supposed to be a prophecy about Jesus being the captain of our salvation. It says, And he said, No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, What does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. This isn't a prophecy. It's from the story of Joshua's conquest of Jericho. It doesn't say anything about a captain of salvation. Like, holy shit, I knew these would be vague, but I had no idea they would just be entirely irrelevant. And yeah, I skipped past the Psalms. Flowery poetry is really easy to reinterpret into whatever you want it to be. There's a reason that's where the majority of the prophecies are from.
And you know Jesus fulfilled all 300 of those predictions?
I don't know, man. From what I've seen, a good chunk of those predictions weren't even predictions. They were just stories. It seems to me like the gospel authors were familiar with the scriptures that their religion held sacred at the time, and wrote the stories of Jesus to contain parallels to the other stories that they considered important. This, to me, seems kind of like saying that the Left Behind books are clear evidence of fulfilled prophecy because they describe events happening just like the book of Revelation said they would. It's not hard to write a character that fulfills a prophecy when the prophecy was written before you write your character's story.
So Dr. Stoner wants to know, what is the probability that anybody can fulfill these prophecies?
Well, I'd imagine it depends on how you look at it. Like, is it just a straight-up numerical calculation, assuming that all people have an equal chance of fulfilling the prophecy, or is it somehow weighted? So, for instance, someone who lives near Jerusalem and owns a donkey is far more likely to ride a donkey into Jerusalem than someone who lives in North America. So, do they get a score that places them as more likely to fulfill that particular prophecy as compared to, say, someone living in Rome who did not own a donkey? Or how about the Native Americans? They'd basically be unable to fulfill any location-based prophecy just because of where and when they lived. Did he take that into account? There are a lot of unanswered questions here, and thus far I have been unable to find Stoner's actual work on the matter. It seems to exist mostly as quoted by Josh McDowell in Evidence That Demands a Verdict, or as quoted by apologists such as yourself when overstating just how much evidence there is for Jesus. Methodology aside, there's a lot of assumptions baked in here, such as the assumption that the books of the New Testament completely accurately describe events that actually occurred. This is an assumption, pure and simple. Even if they were based on real events, there is plenty of evidence that the authors wrote their stories specifically to fit some of these Old Testament prophecies. In fact, Matthew was pretty egregious about being overly literal with the prophecies. That's how we end up with Jesus riding 2 donkeys in Matthew, because he wanted to make extra sure that Jesus' entry into Jerusalem satisfied the prophecy in Zechariah 9:9, as the original Hebrew leaves enough ambiguity that it could just be a flowery way of referring to a colt, but it could also have been referring to a colt and a donkey, and Matthew, wanting to leave nothing open to interpretation, included both. So we have Jesus riding into town on 2 beasts of burden simultaneously. Matthew would rather paint a ridiculous picture of Jesus as some kind of stunt rider than risk not having Jesus fulfill the prophecy. Given this eagerness to make sure Jesus was fulfilling prophecy, is it any wonder that the character looks like he fulfilled some of them? It's not like the gospel authors were unaware of them.
So they said, all right, what are the chances that any human being in the world, from the time of the birth of Christ until the end of the second millennium, 2,000 years, could fulfill just 8 of the prophecies?
Depends which 8. I could work a few of them into my life. I was pierced for your transgressions and crushed for your iniquities. I have received puncture wounds before, some of which required medical attention. And I have been crushed. I have kids after all. Just read Hop on Pop sometime. Just say that it was for your sins, and boom, Isaiah 53 is about me. And as a bonus, nobody denies that I have kids. Well, I don't know of any Christians who think that Jesus has kids. Genesis 3:15, the snake and the offspring of the woman will have enmity. Well, my mother happens to be a woman, and I had to protect my kids from a rattlesnake while we were hiking this summer, so there's 2 for me. Okay, let's look at this list again. For brevity's sake, let's just take it at its word and not check them, because that would just take way too long. Okay, so numbers. Not a bone of him was broken. I've never had a broken bone, so check. A witness. I've seen things. Check. A lot of these are about how he died, so I can't really check those against me because I don't know how I'll die. But a lot more are about God blessing him or him doing God's will. How would you even go about demonstrating that? All we have to go on are stories, and they are stories that, if you already believe them, you don't really need this list of 300 plus prophecies. And if you don't believe them, this list isn't helping any. A lot of the stuff on the list is completely unverifiable, and a lot of them are so vague that they really could apply to a lot of people. So I am really very curious about the methodology used here.
You know what after all their calculations, you know what the chances are? 1 in 10 to the 17th power.
Okay. Did he take into account the fact that the guys writing the stories about the guy who fulfilled the prophecies already knew about these prophecies? Because I feel like that brings the odds up a bit. Now, from here on out, he's just going through and expanding the numbers. If you look at 16 prophecies, it's an even smaller chance. If you look at 48, it's smaller still, and so on. So I'm going to end it here, but there's just one more bit that I want you to see before we go.
They make these predictions about the Messiah, with the last one being 400 years before he was even born. And Jesus fulfills all 300? And you tell me the Bible doesn't apply to today? You're stupid.
Keeping it classy. That's how they end it, by insulting the intelligence of anyone who would dare to question the legitimacy of their arguments. But there's 300 prophecies, though, and the odds of any one person fulfilling all of them are astronomically small. Not really. Not when you consider how vague they are, how a good chunk of them aren't even prophecies, and how the stories of Jesus were written after the fact by guys who knew all these stories. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Science Major and Hexalobular. I chose this for the juxtaposition. Hexalobular asked, "I'm curious, who is the lady in the intro?" And apparently within minutes, Science Major said on a completely different video, "River Song." So I thought at first while scrolling through the comments that they were answering Hexalobular's question, until I realized it was on a completely different video. I thought that was amusing. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the prophecies that tell of the coming of my channel. If you'd like to reference me in only the most vague manner possible, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, the link for that is also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!